But before I switch out of the Trinity studies, let me just bring a few other passages. Do I have time to do this right now? Let me whet your appetite. We'll deal with this next week. If we continue along this theme of loving God and the love of God and the love of Messiah, the love of the Spirit, and we look at it through the lens of our responsibility of loving God Himself. I told you that some passages when it talks about the love of God, right? That's kind of what we might call an equivocation, or it's a little bit ambiguous. What do you mean by the love of God? Do you mean my love towards God, or do you mean God's love towards me? The phrase in the English, the love of God, and even in the Greek, sometimes it's a little ambiguous. Context determines if it's talking about God's love as it is demonstrated towards His subjects, or whether it's talking about the subject's love as it's demonstrated towards God. But next week, we're going to look at a few passages that talk about our responsibility of loving God, how it's tied into God's love for us. We're going to use a passage out of Deuteronomy 6 where it talks about, loving the Lord the God with all your heart. And from there, we're going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and look there how God wants us to love Him, and how this is articulated in terms of having a circumcised heart, down in verse 16 of chapter 10 and things like that. We'll look at that next week. This is all within the scope of God's love and circumcision of the heart. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30, we'll also find that Moshe talks about having a circumcised heart, and how that God Himself is going to be the one who makes sure that the circumcised heart comes to be, loving God with all our heart. God Himself is going to circumcise our hearts and things like that. We'll look at that in Deuteronomy chapter 30 next week as well. And then from there we'll move into Romans, how Paul talks about Jews who are outwardly and inwardly, and the circumcision, how that factors in. If you're loving God with all your heart, how does that factor into love of Messiah? We're going to transition from this love of God into love of Messiah, and how that looks through the lens of circumcision of the heart. And then how Paul challenges the group at Colossae in Colossians chapter 2, that this group, let me click on this verse, has also been circumcised of heart. What does that mean? Circumcised in heart, loving God, loving Messiah. How does that all fit together? We'll look at that next week. Let me close this part of our commentary, exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity. We'll pick all this up again next week, and I hope that you can continue joining us for these particular studies in discussions on the issues of Trinity.